Welcome everybody to our panel today on Reformation-era religion. My name is Dr. Emily Suzanne Johnson. I am a professor of history at Ball State, as well as an affiliate faculty member in women and gender studies and African American studies. Today we have a panel of some really excellent papers on changing ideas about religion, gender, family, healing, magic at the time of the Protestant Reformation in Europe. I have to say, I'm very excited about this panel. As one of the organizers of the conference, I kind of just end up getting put on whatever panel needs a person, and I was excited that it was this one. So the way that this is going to work is we are going to have each of our panelists present in the order that they are listed on the program. I will introduce each one before their presentation. And then if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A at any point. We will save all of those until the end, and I will read the questions to the panelists and moderate the Q&A. But one of the nice things about a Zoom conference is that you can put those questions in as soon as you have them, and they will be queued up for later. So without further ado, I think we will start. Our first presenter today is Kathy Kerton-Johnson, who is a history master's student at Ball State University. She's presenting a paper on what the women's household manuals and commonplace books of early modern England can tell us about shifting attitudes towards healing practices during that time. After earning her master's degree, Kathy hopes to continue on to study a history PhD. She's married with 2 children and owns a homestead farm and restaurant in Upland, Indiana. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. Just make sure that that's all okay. You guys got that there? Okay. And you can all hear me okay? Okay, great. So my paper that I'm presenting on today is titled Domestic Healing Manuals as Signposts of Shifting Ontologies in Post-Reformation England. The early modern period in England experienced great socio-political and economic tension, which manifested in shifting ideas about authority, religious values, and sanctioned power. This era saw a great upheaval in the basic social structures of society. Women as overseers of family and household care were agents and reflectors of these changes in the ways that they responded to social requirements and expectations, how they played their role within the patriarchal and class systems, as well as their curation of domestic religious practice and orthodoxy in a time when the boundaries of expected behavior were constantly changing. A study of household medical practices during this period can give us an insight into the shifting frameworks of family and community culture. Medical practice was a unique aspect of life in that it was ubiquitous across class and gender, as well as reflecting spiritual beliefs about the body and how these fit into the religious framework of institutional and communal practice. For this reason, a study of the accepted and advised medical practices in the home at this time can give a unique perspective on some of the complexities of a world that was both rooted deeply in the past and pioneering towards what we now know as the modern world. The subject of women's daily household practice rose in prominence in historical study during the post-war period of the 20th century, with social and feminist history becoming a driving force in the scrutiny of the daily life of ordinary people. Feminist historians focused on the role of women within the home and community, as well as gender power relations within society as a whole. In social history, research on domestic and communal spaces, the significance of the body, disease, and the natural world, and understandings of identity and spirituality the importance of embodiment in the reflection of control and power dynamics within daily community life, birthed extensive historical study in the practices of medicine, astrology, witchcraft, herbalism, cooking, and alchemy. A particular object of study that epitomized the complexity of domestic life was the commonplace book or paper book. Widely owned blank manuscripts were written in by literate women as a means of recording important and useful information for their management of the household, as well as a type of journal and account book. These gave a glimpse into the physical, emotional, and spiritual world of the housewife and her household. These books almost always contained recipes, not only for cooking meals, but for medicinal preparations, as well as instructions for their use. Passed down through the generations, eventually these books were taken up as a marketable resource by printing houses, and several ladies' manuals, which were derived from the commonplace books of respected women, were printed by men and sold to the general public. And ultimately, women themselves would begin to publish their own ladies' manuals, and this form of advice book for women became very popular. A study of the progression of this type of literature from the early handwritten private manuscripts to the widely published advice books can reveal much of interest in the changing nature of society, family, life, religion, and culture over this period. So I'm focusing on three particular sources, which are a small representation of the wide variety of commonplace books and ladies' manuals that were produced. The first one is by Elizabeth Freke. She was a gentlewoman born of an elite family in 1641 and a longtime resident of rural Norfolk. She kept a series of commonplace books, which were handwritten journals of her family life and relationships, but which also contained detailed medical recipes and treatments with accounts of ingredients and detailed explanations of ailments and their cures. Freke's books give a clear picture of how cooking and the art of, I quote, physic, were combined in the heart of the home, the kitchen. That medical knowledge was considered essential to the housewife, as she was responsible for much of the basic health care of not only her family, but her servants and, as a charitable service, her wider neighborhood. Literate women read widely and were marketed to heavily by booksellers so that their knowledge of health and household management was not only built upon oral and family tradition, but also on ancient and contemporary literature and practice. Recipes were shared socially, and many exact replicas appear in many different personal commonplace books of the times, particularly for general cure-alls, such as tonics, which were used for a wide variety of ailments. In addition, professional physicians, after being consulted for specific illnesses, would sell the recipes for their prescribed remedies to the housewife, and she would concoct it at home with her own store of ingredients. So Freke, like most housewives, was expected to grow a variety of herbs in her garden, as well as to forage for others in her immediate neighborhood. What she could not produce or find herself, she would procure from local herb growers in the markets or the grocers. And finally, more rare ingredients would be supplied by the local apothecary. Freke had the equipment at home to perform quite complex chemical procedures. She had several stills for distilling and grinding and heating equipment. In addition to being more cost-effective, bulk stores of often used medicines would be prepared and built up for quick availability. Throughout her accounts of illnesses and accidents in her household, care within the home is combined with the consultation of professional physicians who are often called out, although Freke does not show a great deal of trust in the efficacy of their treatments. Speaking of her consultation with the doctors over her husband's treatment, she says sarcastically, and I quote, "When it was unanimously agreed that my dear husband should get the next day to be there murdered, as he was, for which I paid them all for this fatal consultation. The first female publisher of household manuals was Hannah Woolley, who was born in 1622. Little is known of her early life, other than that her mother and elder sisters were very well skilled in physic and chirurgery. She was later taken on as a servant by a local noblewoman who evidently added further training to Hannah's medical skills, and eventually she was allowed to treat the sick and injured in the local village as a type of unofficial doctor. After her marriage, she continued to practice medicine in the local area with the sanction of this noble patron. And after 7 years, she published a lady's manual at her own expense called the Ladies' Directory. In addition to recipes for meals and cakes, it included medicinal treatments. Evidently a success, she published further works and became internationally known after her publication of The Queen-like Closet in 1670. Although she was not a noblewoman, Hannah Woolley had progressive views, and she believed in the importance of education for all women. She was evidently confident in her ability to function in the male-dominated world of book publishing, as well as in consulting unofficially in medicine. An exception to the rule at the time, she did, however, make an example for other women to follow, and the publication of ladies' manuals by other women became much more common after her foray into the field. Woolley's manuals contain many of the same recipes written down in Freke's handwritten books. They draw on common cultural wisdom, as well as well-known doctors' cures. Woolley's book adds a greater variety of recipes than found in Freke, and most particular of interest are those that hark back to cures that seem to be of a more ancient local origin. In her work, the lines between learned and folk medicine become more blurred. Prior to the Enlightenment, medical care fell not only to monastic houses, but especially in rural areas to what were called cunning folk, wise men and women who were skilled in herbal arts, as well as traditional cures passed down from pre-Christian pagan times. They were called empirics due to their reliance on observed efficacy rather than learned theory. But this was more of a derogatory term. These men and women used not only herbal medicines, but also supernatural methods to effect cures, as well as solutions to common problems, such as an adulterous husband. These types of practice, often referred to as magic, they were not assigned moral value in itself, but its benefit or maleficence was depended on its use towards the good or the harm of the community or the individual. So before the Reformation, this type of practice existed in uncomfortable proximity with the church. But records of witchcraft accusations from 1450 to 1560 in England show that any that were proclaimed guilty of magic practice were not severely punished. The traditional use of herbs in homes, as well as the embodied and material nature of much of the Catholic Church's spirituality, made it difficult to draw clear lines between sanctioned and unsanctioned supernatural practice, until much of the Catholic Church's traditional practice was swept away with the Reformation. And then anything superstitious, whether Christian or otherwise, became frowned upon. With the rise in witchcraft trials in Europe and Scotland, as well as the growth of Puritanism, the distinction between white and black magic was removed in the cultural consciousness, and instead all types of witchcraft were attributed to the protagonist having made a pact with the devil. At this point, magic was defined as any unauthorized meddling with the supernatural. In light of this new view of magical practices, it's interesting to note in Hannah Woolley's books that recipes based on clearly pre-Christian traditional cures are still included. For example, a certain recipe for a general tonic requires the practitioner to take the skull of a woman or man, grind it up, and boil it into a jelly. Our final example is Gervase Markham's book, Country Contentments, or The English Housewife, published in 1623. Born in 1568, Markham was a gentleman soldier as well as a poet and a prolific author on a wide range of unrelated topics. His pretext for writing this housewife's manual was the patronage of a Lady Frances, Countess Dowager of Exeter. In addition to the usual medicinal and cooking recipes listed together, Markham brings to bear a noticeably moral tone to this work. He adds his own descriptions of what makes a good housewife. I quote, pleasant, amiable, and delightful, as well as underlying the religious expectations that had now become the norm in middle-class households. Markham says, in addition to being religious and of virtuous mind, and learning from the worthy preacher and her husband, housewives should not attempt to preach or interpret scripture themselves, but should be hearers and believers. Despite this puritanical leaning, Markham still includes in his book recipes drawn from magical traditions. For example, take a grey eel with a white belly and put her into a sweet earthen pot, then dig a deep hole in a horse dunghill and set it therein, and drop it into the imperfect ear. He also mentions the importance of taking certain medicines during the wane of the moon, and that when using a dried powdered mole to help an illness, it must be of the same sex as the patient. The combination of belief systems expressed in this work is a glimpse of the complexity that existed in this period. Sorry, I went through way too fast there. The church, on the one hand, was overseeing a powerful change in religious practice and culture, while many household remedies reflected ancient traditional pagan practice. This tension is reflected at a most basic level in the physical space of the kitchen. Not only were Bibles and painted or embroidered Bible verses found in post-Reformation kitchens, but so were hexafoils or witch marks, virgin marks, marks of the Virgin Mary, and witch bottles. There's a sense that they were trying to cover all their bases in a time that had seen the nation swing between Catholicism, Anglicanism, Puritanism, and back again so many times, and seen so much bloody conflict, that absolute confidence in worldview must have been a reality for only the most radical. The Enlightenment is often seen as a top-down revolution, a new way of thinking brought to bear by a small number of genius philosophers whose discoveries changed the way people understood the world. However, the study of household medical practice in early modern England presents a much more nuanced progression. The kitchen was not only where food was prepared, but had always been a type of laboratory where the processes of heating and cooling, emulsification, distillation, crystallization, infusion, and so on were part of the everyday chores of keeping house. These processes formed the basis of early experimentation in chemistry and were, of course, primary concepts in the practice of alchemy, a medieval pursuit whose semi-supernatural promises and premises motivated such great scientists as Isaac Newton and Robert Boyle. The study of plants and the functioning of the natural world was the ancient root of knowledge for healing practices. From the early Greek physicians such as Galen and Hippocrates through the Middle Ages, the medicinal uses of plants were handed down, tested and enhanced, while animals and minerals were assigned specific properties that purported to bring healing. This interest in the natural world developed into the fledgling field of natural philosophy. Of course, the practice of astrology, which was central to medieval healthcare, depended on an intimate knowledge of the movement of the stars and planets, and required instruments to be created that could make the measurements for casting horoscopes. Great astronomers that are remembered today, such as Galileo and Kepler, practiced astrology for clients as a matter of course, and their mathematical and scientific work proceeded from their training in casting horoscopes. At a time marked by transition, the shift in worldview that began with the Enlightenment was followed by the Reformation and completed in the scientific revolution of the modern world is in no place more obvious than in the household practices of the kitchen, garden, and sick room. Ultimately, the seedbed of the science that has transformed the world into the one we know today was the melting pot of traditional and novel experimental practices that took place consistently in the household. The commonplace books of Elizabeth Freke, Hannah Woolley, and Gervase Markham give us a small window into a world that was not only changing rapidly, but also steeped in traditions that had been part of home life since ancient times. The social structures that defined the boundaries of sanctioned power were shifting, and the positions of authority were in some cases tenuous and in others enduring. The modern world of science was in its embryonic form, and the principle of empirical experimentation was at once novel, but at the same time within the age-old realm of the village wise woman. A closer look at the healing practices in early modern English households brings into sharp relief the complexity of the transition from medieval concepts of the universe and our place in it to our worldview today. Magic and science, now seen as polar opposites, were once two sides of the same coin. And women, far from being outsiders in the Enlightenment, had been practicing its basic principles in their kitchens for generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Our next presenter is Juliana Bluhm, who is a senior history and social studies education major at Ball State University. She is presenting a paper about the status of children in Puritan Massachusetts from 1620 to 1689, which she wrote for Dr. Alviz's class on embodiment in the early modern Atlantic world. Welcome, Juliana.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just gonna go for it. So early America was defined by settlers seeking religious freedom. They founded Plymouth in 1620 and created the first colonial settlement in New England. The Puritans arrived 10 years later and eventually absorbed the separatist settlers into their own beliefs. As they were challenged with settling a new colony in unfamiliar lands and legal decisions being imposed slowly, adult life was stressful at best. Going through legal texts and sermons, one question kept rising to the surface: what about the children? So the purpose of my paper was to examine the lives and statuses of children in Puritan Massachusetts from 1620 to 1686. So firstly, how did Puritans define childhood and what makes a child a child? What statuses do children have and how do they evolve as children age? Furthermore, at what point does a child shift in status from child to adult in the eyes of religion and the law? So working chronologically, we're going to go from infancy to childhood, and we're going to look at all these questions. The baptism of infants is the most obvious connection between religion and childhood evidenced in Puritan belief. Infant baptism was, however, contested in some cases, although officially banished in 1648 for not, quote, catechizing on Sundays in the afternoon according to Act of Assembly, end quote. Puritan Thomas Harrison was also accused of, quote, failing to perform the sacrament of baptism according to the canons and order prescribed, end quote. It was on these three charges that he was asked to leave the colony, but the primary are the two mentioned above, or mentioned earlier, indicating the severe lengths the Puritan Church would take to protect itself. Upon the separation of the Puritan, Anabaptist, and Moravian churches, Puritan elders deemed it necessary to clarify their lack of wrongdoing. Within the legal records, the elders distanced themselves and the Puritan Church from the separation, claiming that the Anabaptist and Moravian churches were scandalizing the true intent of God, and in doing so, leaving the Puritan Church on its own. One pastor, John Robinson, argued for infant baptism by saying that if infants do not meet the conditions for baptism, why then do they receive food, as they don't meet those conditions either? Quote, "Neither is it requisite that we prove, as they require of us, that infants have faith and repentance, but let them prove, which they presume but prove not, that the actual having and manifesting of these graces, being conditions requisite for men of years, are to be exacted of infants if they be admitted to baptism. May they not as reasonably and charitably conclude that infants are not to eat, because they work not," from 2 Thessalonians 3:10, end quote. Rather smartly, Robinson claims that if the conditions of faith for infant baptism are required, so then must be the conditions to eat, which no reasonable parent would abide by. By proposing that infants must then not eat, he exposes an almost foolishness of those who do not practice infant baptism. Despite all of this debate, baptism remained an essential part of infancy. High infant mortality rates were largely due to climate, sickness, and lack of appropriate medicine, all of which, leaving the child vulnerable, also led Puritans to infant baptism. Dangers in infancy also included, according to Robinson, quote, "passing sometimes from the womb to the grave, sometimes being born deformed in body, sometimes incapable of understanding, as also in regard of the mother, the first day of their being in the world often being her last in it," end quote. With these factors taken into consideration, historian James Ford emphasizes the importance of baptism. Quote, "The infant was taken to the fireless church for baptism on the very first Sabbath following its birth, even though ice had to be broken in the font," end quote. Regardless of the infant's comfort, baptism in a frozen church was better than not being baptized at all, maintaining the belief that the infant's soul was tainted with original sin. As the child grew, religious impact on their lives did as well. Excuse me. Although Puritans had determined infants were in need of baptism, that by no means meant that these children were fully saved throughout their childhood. As these infants transitioned into childhood, discipline and education came to the forefront. And in both of these respects, religion visibly persisted in the way they were carried out. In discipline and education, Puritan parents had to ensure that their children would become God-fearing and useful citizens in their community in the hopes that they would marry and eventually procreate. Puritans are often characterized as abusive to their children through discipline, with historian Gordon Taylor going as far as calling them quote-unquote sadistic, and according to John Somerville, quote, "drawn to children's vulnerability," end quote. Evidence supporting Taylor can be found in Robinson's work, with passages explicitly detailing scriptural evidence for harsh treatment. Quote, "The wisdom of God is best, and that saith that foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, which the rod of correction must drive out, and that he who spares his rod hurts his son," end quote. With respect to religion, discipline existed to put the fear of God into children. Harriet Tapley describes children as young as 4 repenting and the genuine concern displayed by their parents. And this can be seen with Betty Sewall, which was recorded by her father, Judge Samuel Sewall. Quote, "She was first wounded by my reading of a sermon of Mr. Norton's text, 'Ye shall seek me and shall not find me.' And those words in the sermon, 'Ye shall seek me and die in your sins,' ran in her mind and terrified her greatly. She told me she was afraid she would go to hell. I answered her fears as well as I could and prayed with many fears on either. Hope God heard us," end quote. Albeit only 4 words, Judge Sewall ends with "Hope God heard us," which can be interpreted to indicate the concern he holds for his daughter, not only for her salvation, but also her emotional and physical well-being. There were, however, legal limits to what parents could or couldn't do for their children. As of June 14th, 1642, parents found to be neglecting their children would be, quote, "sufficiently punished by fines for the neglect thereof," end quote. In addition to punishment for neglect, parents could be punished for pushing their children to the point of retaliation, which will be discussed in a later section. However, it's clear that parents walked a thin line between disciplining their children too much, which could result in retaliation, and too little, resulting in charges of neglect and fines. One can reasonably speculate that the greatest concern of Puritan parents was the vulnerability of their children. Just as a child's vulnerability to cards or gambling can lead them into sin, so too could a child's natural pride, if not having been broken by discipline. The vulnerability of the infant is maintained until such a time as the parent forces it out of the child. It's only after this vulnerability is overcome can the child truly begin their education. Robinson explains, saying, quote, "There is in all children stubbornness and stoutness of mind arising from natural pride, which must, in the first place, be broken and beaten down, so that the foundation of their education, being laid in humility and tractableness, other virtues may, in their time, be built thereon." End quote. The education of Puritan children came in different forms, one of these being military training. As of May 14th, 1645, it was decided that, quote, "Whereas it is conceived that the training up of youth to the art and practice of arms will be of great use in this country in diverse respects. From 10 years old to the age of 16 years, they shall be instructed, provided that no child shall be taken to this exercise against their parents' minds." End quote. While this text provides a form of education, it also reveals that until the age of 16, the parents are still making decisions on the child's behalf, indicating that by this time, the child has not fully transitioned into adulthood and is still under parental guidance. Additionally, receiving military training secured the child into a position of usefulness and effectiveness in society, which was really something that parents were hoping for. Robinson explains that in order for children to have an appropriate education, their parents have to determine what their child or children are best suited for. He warns against parental partiality, describing it as, quote, "so gross as they not only deem small good things in them great, and great evils small." End quote. Here again is another thin line that parents need to walk between showing too much partiality or dismissing their child altogether. As seen with the excerpt from Judge Sewall, Puritan parents were expected to care for their children, but could also run the risk of loving their children too much and replacing God in their hearts with their own kids. According to historian William Nelson, educating the town's children was a priority that came second only to the preservation of the church. The purpose of educating children was to ensure that they could read and, quote, "extract the truth from the word of God," end quote. Further advocated by Clifford Shipton, quote, "The essential quality is the right and duty of the individual to make his own personal interpretations of the Bible and of theology, instead of accepting blindly those of the church," end quote. In allowing children to read and interpret the Bible on their own, Puritans challenged the ideas of the Catholic Church and further entrenched themselves in the Protestant belief. Additionally, higher levels of literacy allowed for more male children to attend university in their future. Regardless of these increased literacy levels, Tapley argues that there was always something to catch a child's eye. Quote, "No doubt Puritan children had fewer toys and played more games, for games have survived by word of mouth through generations. Slingshots, whistles, balls, boats, games of soldiers, articles contrived from birch bark gave employment to the boys, while making cats' cradles, dolls, the fun to be derived from the wildflowers of the fields, such as splitting dandelion stems, making daisy chains, weaving garlands of oak leaves, whistling through blades of grass, and many another trick with the leaves and flowers, gave ample opportunity for play among the girls." End quote. Excuse me. Samuel Morrison claims that the schooling and labor Puritan children faced, quote, "was a small price to pay for growing up in a country where there were real Indians and where every household had fascinating things going on, such as spinning, weaving, and dyeing, carpentering, cobbling, and tinkering, husking corn and killing critters, raising colts and calves and lambs," end quote. Despite not having playtime by today's standards, Puritan children had no shortage of games and activities to pass their childhood away. Similar to the present day, the line upon which a Puritan child becomes an adult is blurry at best. There is, however, little evidence of Puritan children being considered adults upon reaching puberty, and the physical ability to procreate does in no way indicate maturity for Puritans. For the Puritan children, the line holding them back from adulthood can be defined through much more aggressive terms. As of November 1646, quote, "If any child or children above 16 years old and of sufficient understanding shall curse or smite their natural father or mother, he or she shall be put to death, unless it can be sufficiently testified that the parents have been very unchristianly negligent in their education of such children, or so provoked by them, by extreme and cruel correction, that they have been forced whereunto to preserve themselves from death or maiming." End quote. From this excerpt, it can be reasoned that by the age of 16, the Puritan child is expected to think for themselves and understand the consequences of their actions. It's important to note that although the accused must be disciplined, they are still referred to as a child. Referring back to what I previously mentioned regarding military training, the age of 16 indicates the child is responsible for their actions so long as they show, quote unquote, sufficient understanding. Another conclusion we can draw from this specifically is that there's a loophole through which children can escape the death penalty. In the event of extreme abuse, the child can argue they were acting in necessary self-defense. However, the testimony of others is crucial for this appeal to work. It was not until 22 years after the legal statute I just mentioned that the age of legal representation was established. This legal representation required that an individual be 21 years old. However, a child of 16 could be put to death for cursing or smiting their parent if they can't provide sufficient evidence of self-defense. Excuse me. Oh, sorry, I lost it. There we go. Sorry, I scrolled a little too far and I lost my spot. Okay, so to wrap up, the concept of Puritan childhood clearly begins with infancy. As infant baptism was debated, the security of the child's immortal soul was determined to be more valuable than explicit scriptural requirements. Childhood was dominated by discipline as the foundation upon which their education stood, and instilling the fear of God into children enhanced their religious education, with children being taught to read the Bible and interpret it for themselves. Play consisted of books, games, and mindless activities meant to pass the time until the point came where you were expected to behave as an adult. The line upon which they became adults lies between the ages of 16 and 21, where they became responsible for their actions and could represent themselves in court respectfully. In some ways, the transition from childhood to adulthood for Puritan children was clearer than it is for children today. The constant religious influence and heavy-handed discipline created an atmosphere of religious centrism that molded Puritan children from birth to adulthood. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana. Our final presenter for today is Emily McGuire, who is a senior history major and women's and gender studies minor at Ball State. She is presenting her blog titled Mary Stuart and the Modern Opinion, which analyzes Mary Queen of Scots' shifting historical narrative through a popular cultural lens, which she created in Dr. De Silva's honors colloquium called The Renaissance in the Modern World. After she graduates this spring, she is planning to pursue a master's degree in history.
Hello, I'm just going to share my screen real quick. All right, can everybody see it? Okay, good. So as Dr. Johnson said, I am Emily McGuire, and I will be presenting my blog, Mary Stuart and the Modern Opinion. As stated earlier, this blog was a result of Dr. De Silva's Honors 390s course, The Renaissance in the Modern World. It is a semester-long project that was really built off of a larger discussion about how popular Renaissance figures, ideologies, or events have been integrated into our modern society, whether that be literature, art, video games, televisions, and even movies. We also heavily discussed the way that these forms of popular culture have influenced historical narratives. Because of this, I was really motivated to analyze how Mary Queen of Scots as a historical figure has been depicted through the centuries in popular culture following her death, and what effect these depictions have had on her historical narrative overall. I was really motivated to look at Mary Queen of Scots because early modern queens have been at the focal point of patriarchal prejudice, and I wanted to see how that influence shows up through popular culture mediums. I discovered that Mary Queen of Scots was really subjected up until recently to this image of adultery and scandal that really never gave her her own voice and independence, especially in comparison to Queen Elizabeth I of England. So just a short biography of Mary Queen of Scots. She was born in Scotland in 1542. However, very early on, she was sent to France to live and grow with her future husband, Francis II, and they would be married in 1558. She would officially ascend to the French throne as queen in 1559. However, Francis II would end up dying in December of 1560, and Mary would be sent back to Scotland to rule as a widowed queen. 4 years later, she ends up marrying her half-cousin Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, and in June of 1566, they had their son James. In 1567, Lord Darnley was actually murdered, and following his death, Mary married James Hepburn, 4th Earl of Bothwell, who was really believed to be the one who orchestrated the murder against her previous husband. Following an uprising against the couple's marriage, Mary was imprisoned, and in July of 1567, she was forced to abdicate her throne, making her son King James the King of Scotland. She then fled to England, seeking the protection of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I of England, and 18 years later, she would be found guilty of plotting to assassinate Queen Elizabeth in 1586, and the following year, she would be executed. So I really began my blog looking at the way Mary Stuart was represented during her reign in Scotland, and the start of her image really begins with Protestant minister John Knox. It's important to note at this time that there was a religious war going on within Scotland against Protestants and Catholics. Here I analyzed the way that Knox destroyed Mary Stuart's image and really began this dyadic relationship between Mary Queen of Scots and Queen Elizabeth I. Knox used this narrative of impurity and failure of Mary Queen of Scots' marriages as a justification that her Catholic beliefs really polluted her mind and her ability to rule. You see this in a variety of his sermons and published works, and he actually utilized Queen Elizabeth I as an example of a woman who could rule. She was a Protestant queen, she was unmarried, and she really just seemed dedicated to ruling. And this would be the beginning of Mary Queen of Scots and Queen Elizabeth's almost entwined narrative to one another, which is really still seen today. Knox was really successful in painting Mary as this adulterer with Bothwell and really just corrupted by her Catholic beliefs. In 1603, her son, King James VI, would ascend the English throne, making him King James I of England. This really created a problem for him. He really needed to justify his Stuart reign in England, as well as emphasize the fact that he had Tudor blood as well. To do this, King James ordered the creation of Queen Elizabeth I and Mary Stuart's tombs in Westminster Abbey, which are actually right across the way from each other. Um, and and this was an effort to present himself as a peacemaker, as well as promote the possibility of a formal union between the two realms. Here, King James was really altering the image of his mother. As you see on the left, her effigy was very ambiguously religious. There's really no indication that she was Catholic at all. And there really is no true queenship iconography. In comparison, Queen Elizabeth's effigy, which is on the right, she's shown as very powerful and very old. She's very obviously a queen, and this suggests a very successful rule. The importance in this case is that as a man, King James has the ability to craft Mary Queen of Scots in that any way that he wishes in comparison to Queen Elizabeth, which we saw with John Knox as well. And this will be a trend that will continue to pop up within the next few centuries. So at the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century, Mary Stuart became a very prominent topic in popular European media. She can be seen in a variety of novels, performances, and even poems. Many of these mediums represent Mary in a similar tone that encompasses tragedy. It's also important to note that during this time, there was a rise in an interest of studying history, but there was also this creation of a more unprofessionalized version produced by those who weren't really considered experts in the field. People were mainly just looking for an entertaining way to learn. And as we know, as historians, historical accuracy is often sacrificed in the name of entertainment. The most prominent popular culture influence that I looked at specifically was the tragic opera called Maria Stuarda, which came out in 1835 and composed by Italian Gaetano Donizetti. It focuses on Mary's imprisonment and execution. It completely disregards the fact that she did rule over Scotland at some point, and as well heavily focuses on her relationship with Queen Elizabeth. The opera places the two queens as rivals based on their love for the Earl of Leicester, and really disregards like any rivalry over power or the English throne and just diplomacy in general. Men especially love seeing women fight, and this is the moment where we get the image of Mary Queen of Scots and Queen Elizabeth meeting face to face and engaging in a confrontation, which never happened. They never met each other in real life. They really only corresponded through letters. More importantly, this is the creation of these two women as characters for entertainment rather than historical figures. This is where we also see the moment where Mary Stuart is not really seen as her own figure, but rather a character that is associated and reliant on her relationship with Queen Elizabeth. And this is done by just entirely focusing on her imprisonment and execution. And this image also follows into the next century as well. With the creation of motion pictures, filmmakers really tried to utilize historical narratives to create on-screen visualizations of the past in order to present them to the modern audience. Mary Queen of Scots' tragic story that was told in the 19th century really carries through the 20th century with these two biopic films by the same name in 1936 and 1971. It's important to note that both of these films were directed by men, and you really do see the very sexist understanding of just women in power. In both of these films, Mary Queen of Scots is a classic example of a queen who is come undone due to love and tragedy. These films focus on her tragic endings to her three marriages, and essentially, Mary Queen of Scots is portrayed as someone who really put the quote role of woman before the role of queen. She's really never happy until she's married and has children. And you can see this emphasis in the 1936 poster on the right with her and the Earl of Bothwell in the corner, kind of in an embrace. You also see this theme of Mary versus Elizabeth carry through, and their differences are exploited in the movies through depictions of the two women meeting, which again never really happened in real life. You can see this in the poster for the 1971 version here. Here, Mary is dressed in pink. She's very feminine looking, and she's kind of shying away from the viewer, whereas Queen Elizabeth is very strong looking. She's in yellow, which is a very non-binary color, and she's given the power by facing the audience. And she's also just very masculine looking in general. Here, Mary's character becomes a victim queen, and again, the focus is really on the tragedy of her imprisonment and execution in these films. This narrative that was really cultivated in the 19th century is really emphasized within the motion picture industry at this point. However, in 2013, the CW presented a new and refreshing narrative for Mary Queen of Scots, which has been largely influenced by the shift in historiography of studying early modern queens. More and more female historians in the last 20 years have began creating new images of early modern queens through biographies, journal articles, and really focusing on their reigns rather than their love life. And this influenced the creation of a new empowering narrative for just women in power. And this can be seen with Mary Queen of Scots in the TV show Reign. Reign garnered a huge following during its production, and its success can really be found in the modern depictions of Mary Stuart and the female figures around her. Reign is a majority female cast. The men really are just adding extra drama to the plot. It really just follows the women around. And Reign begins to create this narrative that Mary was a woman with agency. She's really shown as someone who's independent and intelligent and really exercising her own free will. Her ladies in waiting also offer Mary this kind of support group and a sense of sisterhood, which really shows these women always coming out on top. Rain also sets itself apart from shows like the Borgias or the Medicis because it doesn't present these women simply as sexual objects through various sex scenes with nudity. The characters' sexual relationships in the show are really just shown freely without much of an involvement with reputation or religion that is also often associated with early modern queens. And the romances are really just used for tools for entertainment to appeal to the fantasy of love rather than a way to degrade the woman's character. And this is really, it just promotes a more empowered message for younger audiences who are becoming curious about relationships. Um, the predominantly female cast and depiction of strong female leading characters cultivated the TV show success, as I said, and you can really see this emphasis on strong women in this movie poster. There's no men, they are all facing the audience, and the emphasis is solely on these women, which again really emphasizes the fact that this is what the show is about. Mary Stuart's narrative at this point has really shifted from a character full of patriarchal influence, tragedy, and to a narrative that is strongly independent, full of agency and sisterhood. Rain really does pave the way for a new narrative that positions early modern queens like Mary Stuart as figures that cultivate feminist thinking in young women and convey a positive message of historical female empowerment. And this depiction can be seen in the most recent movie about her called Mary Queen of Scots, which was created in 2018. This film is a historical drama um, about Mary Stuart's life, and it was directed by female director Josie Rourke. The movie focuses heavily on her reign in Scotland, as well as her relationship with Queen Elizabeth, so this theme really does continue to follow through to today. However, it's different in that the relationship between these two women is full of much more cooperation. The two women really acknowledge that they are alone, and because they are women rulers in a world that is really full of powerful men. Mary and Elizabeth are shown attempting to build a political relationship between their two countries, and really this gives the audience again a sense of sisterhood. The focus isn't on a love story, but rather the narrative shifts to one that is focused on diplomacy and empowerment of women in leadership roles. The movie does end on Mary Queen of Scots' execution. However, Mary makes a statement to Elizabeth accusing her of murdering her own sister and queen, which emphasizes again that this movie and these ladies are really just about coming together and cooperating and kind of coming over the patriarchal obstacles that have been set forth. By the end of the movie, Mary's figure as a queen is transformed into one that is independent and powerful, and the film really shows her as a queen rather than a weak and emotional woman who is destroyed by love. And as you can see, Mary Queen of Scots has been at the center of the ever-shifting popular historical narrative. She began as a symbol of Scottish identity, failed female leadership, and Catholic martyrdom, making Mary a prominent tragic figure in popular culture from art, literature, plays, and more recently, television and movies. However, with the increase of female historians studying early modern queens and coupled with the influence of female directors and writers, Mary's characterization has shifted from portraying female emotional weakness and religious sacrifice to female collaborative strength and hardship and struggle against patriarchal prejudice. Mary Stuart, in the modern opinion, is actually the starting point of a much larger project that I worked on with Dr. De Silva over the summer through the undergraduate honors fellowship program. We worked together to create a journal article titled Revising Mary Queen of Scots from Protestant Persecution to Patriarchal Struggle for the Journal of Religion and Film, which will be published in April. Essentially, it is a much larger, more in-depth version of my blog. So if you are really that interested in Mary Queen of Scots' historical narrative, you should be sure to check that out. And that is it.
Thank you, Emily. So I will offer a few comments. I also want to invite all of our attendees to join the conversation. I already see one question in the Q&A. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom there to ask any questions, and I will pose them to our panelists. So again, I just want to thank you all for your excellent papers. I think each of you looks at the question of gender, religion, and popular culture in different ways and in slightly different contexts, but all sort of centering around this idea of women's authority and definitions of both sort of womanhood and childhood in the context of a changing religious landscape. I think one of the things that I wanted to point out from Kathy's paper is this important acknowledgement that although we in our modern context tend to see science and religion as being polar opposites, it actually makes more sense in this early modern period not to see them as opposites and not even necessarily to put them on a spectrum at all, but to think of them as overlapping categories. I think this is a really, really important insight and a really great example of the kind of work we need to be doing as historians in terms of finding our own assumptions and then leaving them behind as much as possible. In Juliana's paper, the question of what childhood is continues this sort of trend of taking something that we take for granted and looking at how it was defined in a particular historical moment. I think the strength of Juliana's paper here is using what is ultimately sort of limited sources to try and tease out this question that is not something that Puritans are necessarily writing about explicitly, but that we have to find by reading between the lines. And then finally, I love that Emily's paper sort of takes us from the Reformation moment into the present and into the ways in which we are now thinking about and remembering the Reformation. Whereas Kathy and Juliana's papers both look at, to some extent, the popular culture of the early modern period, Emily is looking at our popular cultural representations of the early modern period. So I have a couple of questions that I will ask, but I think I would like to start with the questions in the Q&A. So the first one is from Dr. De Silva, who says, thank you for the 3 fascinating presentations. My question will likely have very different answers from each of the panel's presenters. Nevertheless, I would like to know how each of you see female authority upheld, subverted, or ignored in your research. Asking where are the women is no longer enough. Now we need to ask, where do we see women's authority? So since this is a question for all 3 panelists, maybe we could go in the order of the program again.
Okay, yeah. I think there's a lot of ways that we can see female authority changing over this period. And so I'm just going to focus particularly on what I saw in terms of, just as an example, the medical practice, because I think it's a great area to look at. It's kind of a microcosm of what was probably happening in several areas. But women had a great deal of authority in medical practice during the medieval times, particularly, as I said, because they kind of were the repositories of common knowledge in terms of healing practices, and they would pass on their knowledge to the next generations and would teach their knowledge to their children. And men had very little role in terms of household healing practices. And there was the role of monasteries and the monks, but that was very much a kind of specialist type of care, whereas women really had to deal with everyday illnesses and diseases, accidents and that type of thing. And in that sense, they had a huge amount of autonomy in that they were respected, and they were the first port of call for not only their household, but if they, for example, Hannah Woolley, she was known in her community as having surgical skills and medicinal knowledge that she had built up over her lifetime, and so she was a kind of unofficial doctor. There was a growing number of men particularly in the cities, who became kind of licensed physicians. And the evidence shows that there were physicians in the countryside, but they were quite rare. And so they would have been in demand for, as I said, like Elizabeth Freak, she had to call out the physician, and it was her kind of final port of call after she had tried everything for her husband. And so there was a great deal of, they had to travel for hours to either get to the physician or have them called in. And so men in that sense were, there was almost a sense of they were an other. They were outside of the household, they weren't necessarily trusted. But as the Enlightenment period continues, there seems to be this growing realization that men are becoming more authority in medical practice. The London College of Physicians, they start to insist that apothecaries are licensed, that and so they have growing authority. And so this is why it's interesting to look over this period. Women are slowly losing their authority because their traditional practice is eroding in the face of this growing idea that science is the authority of all things, and that the traditional wifely practice is more amateurish and not to be trusted. So yeah.
I guess it's my turn. So largely in my research for the sources that I was able to get that were primary, none of them were written by women. So we really don't, I really didn't find any specifically female authority based on what I found. Any sources that I did find that were written by women or had female sort of interjections, those were all very much recent, within the last 40 or 50 years or so, which is a real bummer. But what I do see in my research is that specifically the education of children at this point, it's still very separated by sex. It's still very masculine and very feminine, traditionally masculine and feminine means of education, or even just rearing the children. I don't believe I included it in this presentation, but there was still the aspect of women doing most of the education for the children, or much of the house rearing. But other than that, we really don't see, based on what I could find, at least in my limited time that I had to do this, and I would love to look into this more so much, but based on what I could find, there really is no women's authority other than what we would traditionally see in the male versus female or masculine versus feminine gender roles.
So in the case of my presentation, really what you see in terms of female authority, it is largely subverted and ignored throughout the centuries in terms of Mary Queen of Scots. And you see this with Queen Elizabeth as well. Largely their representations are focused on their sexual history and their religion. Obviously, as you get into the 21st century, you do see the influence of women more so with female directors and historians in terms of their historiography. But yeah, I guess really it's very recent, this thing with early modern queens, that these women are given voices, and it's largely focused on their diplomacy and their political history rather than the fact that they've been married or unmarried and who they've been involved with in terms of a man, essentially.
And I think that's so interesting, Emily, that there's that sort of layering of women's authority, because in the historical profession, it's only been maybe half a century that women have had a lot of authority in terms of writing the histories, right? In terms of being the historians. And that really matters. The next question we have is for Juliana, which is just a question of what sources did you find for your paper?
So a lot of my primary sources came directly from legal texts, which I had to scour through those things because unfortunately there's no index to tell you what deals with what. So there was a lot of reading there. But it was a lot of scouring legal texts, trying to find, I looked through a lot of sermons. I wasn't able to cite very many, but I was able to find some sermons. And then pretty much everything dealing with the concept of childhood was secondary sources because the Puritans really didn't have an idea of childhood as much as we do now. So that was a bit of a struggle. But generally speaking, I used a lot of legal texts, sermons, and then a lot of secondary sources from historians who really focus on childhood.
So we have a series of questions now from Dr. Etchison, one for each presenter, and I will read them in order. So the first is for Kathy, which says, in the colonies, there is a hostility between female healers and male doctors, especially as medicine emerges as a profession. Elizabeth comment about doctors murdering her husband indicates that there is hostility there. Was there a lot of contest between women healers and doctors for control over healing? And can you talk about how they competed or cooperated?
Yeah, I mentioned a little bit earlier already about how that competition definitely grew as the medical profession grew in terms of the number of men. And I think particularly the area that can help us see this in a focused way is midwifery, because the delivering children and taking care of prenatal mothers and newborns was very much a female domain for millennia. But during this time, over the Reformation, during the Renaissance, men became increasingly involved in this. And in the medieval times, it would have been shocking to have a man involved in a woman giving birth, except for at the very highest levels in the elites. So when you look at queens giving birth, for example, they would have had a court physician there, but that was very, very unusual. But then over this period, we see a growing number of men practicing obstetrics, and I think there is a huge conflict at this point between the midwifery profession and the male physicians. And I saw that in some of the literature. And what was particularly interesting was that as we get towards the Restoration, it becomes actually quite fashionable for noble women to have a man deliver their baby. And I think this is just, there's a sign here of change in terms of authority over the childbed. And this, again, it's a sign of the ancient traditions are seen as superstitious, and they're seen as part of a passing history that, now we're moving into a modern time where men can be scientifically in control of childbirth. And it's interesting that it begins at that higher class level and then starts to filter down into the middle classes, who obviously want to kind of follow the fashion of the nobility. But I would say that right up until today, in terms of everyday women, there is still a desire for a midwife to be in charge of childbirth. Not all women are that way, but it hasn't disappeared completely. It hasn't moved over to a male domain completely. I would say in the 1950s, perhaps there was another struggle, but yeah, now it's pretty balanced.
Wonderful. So for Juliana, and this is also from Dr. Etchison, how did Puritan child rearing practices differ from other groups in the Reformation period, such as Anglicans or Catholics? What do you see as distinctive about colonial Puritan practices?
So the one thing that really caught my eye, and the reason I chose to write my paper over this, was that one particular segment in which a 16-year-old could be killed should they smite or curse their parents. And that really speaks to the idea that Puritans were overly aggressive and ultimately abusive to their children. And that's really not something that you hear about the Anglicans or the Catholics. You really only hear that about Puritans. With Anglicans and the Catholics, you still see the emphasis on being a productive member of society, becoming very whole in your faith, getting married and having more kids. Like, those are all still extremely important in the Anglican and Catholic child rearing practices. But generally what we see as the difference is the traditional idea of Puritans being so aggressive with their kids. And that's like the main difference that I can confidently talk about, because I didn't have a lot of time to look into the other religions. And I know I keep saying the same thing, that I didn't have a lot of time, and I wish I could have looked more into it. So I wish I could give you a better answer. But really the distinction between Anglicans, Catholics, and Puritans is simply the concept of Puritan aggression and abuse tendencies toward their children.
One of the purposes of academic conferences is that people ask us questions that we didn't have time or didn't think to look into. And the correct answer is always, thank you, and I will look into that later. So don't worry about that. I would also, and you may not have an answer to this, but I wonder if Puritan aggression is something, as you put it, is something that is limited to their approach to children, or if it's something that we can see in Puritan law more generally, a kind of willingness and joy in capital punishment, I think.
I mean, I know reading through all of those laws, there were a lot of things. I believe in one instance, there's a lot of laws about pigs.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of laws about pigs, and not near as many laws about children, which I thought was very interesting. But they do seem more concerned with territory, or personal property is that's a better word for it, than they do for regulating childhood, or like how you're supposed to raise your children. So yeah, that's something else that like I need to look into a little bit more, or I'd love to look into a little bit more, but I can't give you a straight answer for that one.
That's fine. And so Dr. Etchison says, for Emily, how do these more recent, more feminist interpretations of the relationship between Mary and Elizabeth portray Elizabeth's ordering Mary's execution? This does not seem to fit the model of feminist sisterhood. I would say, as someone who studies feminist and anti-feminist movements in the 1970s, I can imagine some of those women ordering each other's executions.
No, what's interesting is Reign and the movie kind of disregard completely the fact that Mary was a part of the Babington plot, which was the plot to assassinate Queen Elizabeth. And they kind of jump straight to the execution scene. In terms of Reign, it really places the blame on her son. Mary is seen kind of waiting for her son to give the word to like rescue her from England, or give her like a letter saying that she can come back, because she was banished at this point. And there's a very pivotal scene right before her execution where Queen Elizabeth is talking to King James and basically accusing him of refusing to save Mary because she is ultimately standing in the way of him fully reigning over Scotland. She's more seen as somebody who is kind of more of like an obstacle. He can never fully be in power with Mary still being alive. In terms of Mary Queen of Scots, the film, the execution scene, there's a very long, or it's not super long, but there's a very powerful monologue that she gives that is dedicated to her son James, who will become the eventual king of Scotland and England. And throughout the film, she's really trying to unite the kingdom. She believes that she has a right to the English throne rather than Elizabeth. And she's really pushing Elizabeth to name James her successor, which is really like the whole entire plot. And with this monologue during the execution, she really states that she ends up winning because James does take over the English throne, and it ends where Mary is really like the force that succeeded in uniting the two countries. So in this place, it really isn't super feminist, but it places Mary's narrative as one that is powerful and strong. In the past depictions, you see her failing ultimately, but with the 2018 movie, she wins, which is a huge shift in the original narratives of her.
And Dr. De Silva has sort of a follow-up question for Emily. As queens become stronger autonomous figures, what happens to religion?
In terms of religion, you don't really see religion take a huge role in terms of Mary, Queen of Scots and Queen Elizabeth, especially in Reign. There really isn't a mention of religion. With the movie, religion is more of something that she is pushing against, I guess. Religion is, in my opinion, something that can be very patriarchal. So it's more of an obstacle that I feel like these women as figures are trying to overcome, because it is very dictative of how they live their life and how they're supposed to present themselves. So I feel like that is the direction that it is going. It's more of an obstacle rather than something that is used to like define them.
That's really interesting. And thinking about my own work, which is about anti-feminist religious women in the 1970s, there are feminist religious movements. There are even feminist religious movements within evangelicalism. But as we move into this culture war narrative, we sort of get religion being associated with conservatism and liberalism, leftism being associated with irreligion. And so I wonder if that kind of conflation is then being carried into our assumptions in popular culture, that like, as we have more autonomous, more feminist looking characters, they will necessarily be less religious.
No, for sure. I definitely agree with you. I think it's really just I guess, assumption that religion can be very oppressive towards women that kind of makes it more of something that isn't like a definite, I guess, association with them.
Great. If anybody else has any other questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. I have a couple of questions that I would like to pose as we're waiting for other ones. Starting with Kathy, one comment and one question. Your work on thinking about how witchcraft, magic, Catholicism, Protestantism are all working together reminded me of John Butler's book in the American context called Awash in a Sea of Faith, where he also shows the ways in which these folk religious practices are interacting with Christian practices in interesting ways. And speaking of sources, he used probate records for that. So looking at the books that people owned upon their deaths. The question that I have is, you show how sort of the Protestant Reformation created these changes within Protestant communities and kind of definition of what Protestant healing practices would look like. And I wondered, and maybe you addressed this and I missed it, but did you see any evidence of the Catholic Church responding to that kind of Protestant narrative? Did the Catholic churches or Catholic practices change as well?
Because I was looking at households, what I saw was what you would expect to see, that you over this period you've got the Reformation that started with Henry VIII, where he separated from the Catholic Church, but he didn't, in a sense, destroy Catholicism. He just created a kind of new English Catholicism. And so at that point, you do have some kind of external things happening, like the monasteries being destroyed, and Henry was at some periods was very anti saints' shrines and pilgrimage, although he went on pilgrimage himself. So he was quite a complicated character. And I think that in Holmes, as these things started to play out, once Henry died, then we kind of get this very Puritan time where his son Edward comes to the throne, and he was brought up as a, much more kind of Puritan, almost an extremist. And then a whole lot of laws come in, and I expect those laws would have been affecting how people saw themselves. Like, what is my religion now? What is my faith? What do I do with the practices in my home that have been part of the traditions of because the church was so much part of daily life, that when you start having changes like we're no longer allowed to have candles on plow day, for example, because it's seen as superstitious, these sorts of practices would have started to be questioned. And the homes that continued certain practices would have been seen as, oh, they are part of the old ways. And then and so there becomes this division. But I think that it was very gradual. And of course, in Mary, the first comes in and tries to bring back Catholicism and tries to rejoin Rome. And so it's all thrown out, and it's all back to the beginning. And so I didn't study what the church was doing, but I did see in homes that there was a sense of, well, they can't seem to make up out there, they can't seem to make up their minds. And people held on to things that would have been private, because they were practices within the kitchen, within the bedroom, things that people out there might not have been able to see. And so they could get away with holding on to those things. I'm going to continue a study on this, actually for my research project with Dr. Alves and Dr. De Silva, about some of the home practices that continued through the Reformation, particularly in cooking and hospitality, where you have aspects of medieval life that still exist today. And why did those things continue? The church had very little voice in those. It was really about home tradition and the way that people expressed their faith. I don't know if that answers your question.
Absolutely. It answered my question and told me a lot of other interesting things. Dr. Etchison asks Juliana, you mentioned that boys got more schooling. Can you expand on that? Were girls taught to read in order to read the Bible? Were there other ways besides education in which boys and girls were raised differently?
Yeah, so it was actually part of the legal codes that it said specifically all children had to learn how to read so they could interpret the Bible for themselves. The Puritans were very scared of their children just kind of going with whatever the pastor said and just kind of being okay with that. There were actually, I had to take it out for this presentation, but there were several books that I found. One of them was called Apples of Gold, War with the Devil, and I believe The Glorious Lover. All three of those were books specifically written for Puritan children, and they all had references to eternal damnation, things like that, which Somerville actually talked about how these kids would just kind of laugh it off and do it in a sing-song kind of voice because they were so used to it. But no, there are records of girls being able to read and actively reading in their spare time, assuming they had any. Other than that, boys did just receive longer education, strictly schooling. Other than that, nothing in education itself seemed, from what I've been able to find, seemed strictly separate between boys and girls. The only other ways they would be educated differently was in domestic or physical activities. So the boys were out in the fields, girls were in the household learning how to sew and cook and things like that. Other than that, I didn't find anything saying that their education was terribly different. And of course, there might be. I'd love to look into it more. But based on what I found, not really, surprisingly.
And Dr. Etchison asks Kathy, presumably Hannah Woolley wasn't really making jelly out of skulls, so why did she have the recipe?
Well, I think it's interesting to compare Hannah Woolley's book and Elizabeth Freke's book, because Hannah Woolley's book was particularly written for publishing. And so we don't really know whether she was actually making, were these the things that she used every day? She may have made jelly out of skulls, and presumably some people did, if it was popular a recipe enough to put in her book. Or maybe it was a little bit of shock factor. But we don't really know whether she was using them or not herself. But what's interesting is in Elizabeth Freke's book, because it's her own personal journal, we know which remedies she was using personally, and she records using them and how they worked and whether she thought that they were working or not. And so there's much more of an insight into which recipes people were actually using. And Elizabeth Freke does talk about using particularly magical, what we would see as magical type remedies, such as amulets that you wear around the neck with kind of pieces of animals in them and that type of thing. And she talks about using those. So yeah, I think we will never know if Hannah Woolley made jelly out of skulls, but I think that it was obviously something that she felt was important enough to put in her book for her readers.
And Dr. De Silva asks a follow-up question. Is there evidence of the use of sacramentals in the kitchen as well, or in kitchen texts?
I did not see any recipes or any remedies that included, the holy bread or wine or anything like that. And I think that, and this I'm speculating, I think that that would have been the preserve of the church to be able to use those sacraments in. However, there's definitely aspects of prayer, so specific prayers that you can pray for specific things. And so mixing traditional, almost pagan remedies with specific prayers that you had to say, like you would say the Pater Noster several times, with this particular remedy and that type of thing. But I think that the use of the physical body and blood of Christ was never really mentioned at all, and I think may have been the preserve of the church or priests in healing. Yeah.
Emily, if we could watch only one film or TV show about Mary, Queen of Scots, which one do you recommend?
I definitely recommend the 2018 version. I think it was my favorite out of all of the ones that I've looked at, really just in terms of creating Mary, Queen of Scots as her own person. I think that was what I liked the most about it. Reign is not accurate whatsoever, and I feel like Mary, Queen of Scots, the film, is actually more true to her own biography. So yeah, I would definitely recommend it.
I'm not seeing any more questions. I am seeing congratulations from both Dr. De Silva and Dr. Etchison. And I would just like to echo those congratulations. These were really excellent papers. I loved reading them and I loved hearing about them. It's really clear how much research, how much thinking's gone into all of this. So I think that I will close out the panel unless there are any last burning questions. I want to thank everyone for attending, to remind you that we do have another day of panels tomorrow starting at 9:10, and then of course our keynote at 11. Thank you, everybody.